though time might be ecstatic, it's not infinite for us, right? That there's a finitude to our lives, and that we are all going to be annihilated. And I will say Heidegger is quite chilling about this, where he will often use that term, at least in translation, right? Where we will pass from out of nothing and back into nothing. That's kind of a defining feature of human existence. And this generates a lot of angst on our part, right? This is sometimes translated as anxiety or angst, but it's ultimately a term from that he plagiarized from Kierkegaard and didn't give him nearly enough credit for. Some people might have read the concept of anxiety. But when we feel this kind of angst, it can provoke us to respond in a wide variety of different ways, some of which he talks about. Now, a more positive way of responding to this angst would be to live what he calls authentically. And this is where we're starting to get into really dangerous territory. Because again, influenced by this conservative revolutionary thought, not everyone is going to live authentically, right? There'll be a kind of rarefied elite that will choose to live authentically. But most people won't have the will to do this, right? Or the strength to do this. They will retreat into the world of das Man, right? Or average everydayness in this crude pejorative sense, which he associates with urban life in big cities, particularly big social democratic cities like Berlin, which he tested, right? Where you see a kind of mass culture emerging. And he means mass culture in the pejorative sense that it's always described with when it comes to German revolutionaries, right? Democratic, venal, rule of the mediocre, right? People just engaged in what he calls idle, meaningless chatter about unimportant things. And in these kinds of contexts, it can be very difficult for these kinds of exceptional moments to emerge where you can genuinely live authentically, right? And he's deeply worried about that because he thinks that in the modern world, particularly one that increasingly seems to be governed by planetary technology, yes, but also liberalism and socialism as the kind of ruling ideologies or ruling political ideologies associated with planetary technology, it's going to become more and more an inauthentic kind of world. And he's going to eventually start to see in Nazism a kind of a safety valve or an escape valve from this. And that leads us, I think, pretty nicely into his politics. But that's kind of the transition, I think, that takes place in Being in Time. And I think there's one other important thing that I should note here. Many people interpreted Being in Time, the sign, being there in Being in Time, as a purely individualistic kind of examination of human beings' existential relationship to being, right? However, if you read Being in Time closely, at the end, he expressly says, Dasein is not purely an individualistic notion. It always needs to be understood in these very collective, nationalistic, Volkish terms. And this raises the question, he says at the very conclusion, of collective authenticity on the part of the nation. Pretty chilling. And
I mean, this is honestly, it kind of makes me think of something I think George Orwell actually says about the Nazis, that is like, what does he say? It's like the promise of socialism and in a different way of liberal capitalism. This, is ultimately, I'll give you a good time. The promise, the promise of Hitler was, I'll give you suffering and death, and fulfills the promise, and an entire nation lays itself on his feet or something like that, right? It's like, I'm mangling the quote, right? But it's like along those lines, and I think the point that Orwell's getting at is that there's this sort of like very explicitly part of the appeal of fascist politics is this sort of non-instrumental. It's like, not that like politics is this way of like getting you things that you want, but it's that it's something closer to what you're talking about. That there's that it's like, oh, this is going to be this like more authentic form of life, and like, man, there's nothing that's more authentic than suffering.
Oh, absolutely, right. And this becomes really clear in his work in the 1930s, where he becomes even more influenced by Nietzsche than he was in Being in Time, drops a lot of the interest in people like Kant and Husserl, and of course, really enters into his Nazi phase. And I want to be clear about this. This was an enthusiastic embrace, at least for a few years, right?
Yeah.
There are two things that people should read if they want to understand this. there's the rectoral address where he lays out his vision of a new German Volk and encourages his students to support Hitler and Hitlerism. Horrible piece, right? Just damning to the umpteenth degree, right? The more interesting one, though, is his piece, Introduction to Metaphysics, particularly the first bit of Introduction to Metaphysics, where he talks about the role that he thinks Nazism is supposed to play in the world and who the rivals of the Nazi regime are. And here I want to make a slightly technical point, but it's an important one. Again, I think that there's a materialist way of reading Division 1 of Being in Time that people like, say, Merleau-Ponty or Jean-Paul Sartre take up. And that would probably be the safest way to make the insights of Heideggerianism palatable for the left. Heidegger doesn't go that route. He instead goes the route of almost every, with the exception of Nietzsche, major German conservative revolutionary, and he just leaps headfirst into idealism to the fucking umpteenth degree. Because now he's starting to develop this philosophy of history beyond just focusing on the historicity of Dasein. It's now really trying to understand the different epochs through which humanity has progressed, each one of which is defined by this metaphysical way of conceiving being, which is a very grandiose way of thinking about things if you're a philosopher, since, of course, if you think that the primary things that define any epoch are its metaphysical sensitivities, then of course that gives a very privileged role for philosophers to play in the kind of society that they're a part of, since they alone have an understanding of the kind of Rosetta Stone through which everything else can be understood. And the Marxists, again,
thought about this for a long time, that it's like, I think part of the reason that like something like idealism is always so appealing to philosophers is like, of course it fucking would be. That's like it's like, hey, do you want the view of history that says that like what you're doing is basically epiphenomenal, or do you want the view of history that says that like that you're right at the heart of the thing that's the most important for understanding everything that ever happens?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where Heidegger gets, really, the only way to describe it is pretty funny, right? Because the more pompous he gets, the more inflated his expectations of the regime and himself become, and the bigger the fall that ultimately emerges. But, Introduction to Metaphysics lays this all out in actually surprisingly clear detail. Like, I'm not saying it's an easy book, but compared to Being in Time, certainly that first chapter is pretty easygoing. But he says, look, we've entered into a nihilistic epoch. The rule of planetary technology is everywhere present. Planetary technology is defined by this nihilistic sensibility where human beings adopt this subject-object relationship to the world and just see everything as a kind of standing reserve to be manipulated to gratify human needs. And the appropriate political systems for this nihilistic outlook are liberalism, socialism, and democracy. Now, this is going to piss a lot of people off, but like a lot of people on the far right, he says that these are all essentially one and the same. And I think here he's really a very inferior interpreter compared to someone like Nietzsche, who had a lot more interesting things to say about this. But the reason they'll say things like, look, liberalism, socialism, and democracy are all metaphysically the same are because he says, look, ultimately, communists and liberals or capitalists are just debating about the technical ways to go about expropriating everything in the world to put it to human needs, right? The capitalists have a very technical way of thinking about that, predicated on free markets. The communists have their way of thinking about how we can best mobilize the resources of the earth to satisfy human needs. But at the epicenter, they're the same metaphysical outlook, right? And they also have this democratic quality to them in that they're both humanisms, right? They both think that ultimately we should try to give as many people as much stuff as possible, and that will make them happy. And he's emphatically contemptuous of that, because he thinks that Germany, as the most specialist country in the world, right? The country of the center, the one that's more spiritually attuned, all this very pulpy Nazi rhetoric alone can serve as a kind of bulwark against Russia and America. And eventually, hopefully, a new world order will emerge as part of the new German Reich, or as the new German Reich ascends in power. And this will lead to the collapse of liberalism and socialism, and potentially a transition to a new, less nihilistic epoch. And Heidegger said some truly appalling things in line with this way of thinking about things, and sometimes very just transparently contradictory things. So, for instance, when the Nazis occupied France in the 1940s, he famously wrote a letter saying, well, this vindicates my theory, because of course it does, right? We've entered into a new era. Nazi arms and the spirit of the German people have prevailed against their technologically oriented, nihilistic, decadent liberal enemies. Huzzah. And then, of course, at the end of the Second World War, he was like, well, this doesn't really settle anything, right? The fact that Germany was occupied by the wretched Americans and Soviets and is now literally divided between them, I will still be vindicated in the long run, right? Maybe a couple of centuries. And you're like, sure thing. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. Probably for me, the most awful thing that he ever said. Well, there were two things. One was when he was pressed to say something about the Holocaust, which, if you think about it, seems to embody at least elements of his thinking better than many other things that you can think of, right? There's a literal reduction of human beings into objects and their mass incineration by industrial techniques. He actually makes that connection, but then he says, look, ultimately, the Holocaust is just of a piece with agricultural farming. Because these two things are metaphysically the same. There's that idealism again. And so we shouldn't be paying too much attention to the Holocaust because we're perfectly comfortable with industrial farming, right?
Yeah, it's Jean-Marie Le Pen thing, right? It's a detail of the history of the Second World War.
Exactly, right? And another even more crass kind of exoneration that he tries to wheel out is when he says things like, well, the Sudeten Germans also had it rough at the end of the Second World War. The second Sudeten Germans were kind of forced to emigrate from the Sudetenland into Germany proper.
Yeah, he has, it's the, so there are these things, we actually did a bonus episode about this, I don't know, a couple of years ago, where looked at these letters back and forth between Heidegger and his extremely disappointed former student Marcuse, who is saying, hey buddy, you supported this psychotic mass murderous dictatorship that tried to take over the world and exterminated millions of people for sharing my ethnicity. Could you maybe spell out for me that you at least feel bad about that now? And he doesn't quite in his responses, and I remember that was part of it, that he was like, well, look at all the bad things the Soviets did to Germans in Eastern Europe after World War II. So it's like, hey, while we're throwing things around, it's like, Germans did bad things, Russians did bad things, whatever, man.
Oh yeah, like it's Fox News whataboutism, and you'd expect that from fucking Tucker Carlson, or even from Jordan Peterson or something, not from a thinker like Heidegger, who, say whatever you will about him, took himself really very seriously to a truly clownish degree at points. But I also want to say he did give a final interview in 1971, I think it was, maybe 1972, for Der Spiegel, that he allowed, where he allowed the interviewees to talk to him about his politics and what happened during the Nazi regime, on condition that the interview not be published until after he passed away. And it's a really revealing interview because he does kind of acknowledge that, yeah, maybe I've made a few personal errors, but it's all in a very academic, scholarly, he who thinks great thoughts will make great errors kind of ways. And it kind of vacillates between this very grandiose sense of himself as the voice or the mouth or the prophet of being, and some truly mundane academies. And these two lines of rhetorical justification do not sit well with one another. I mean, one of the other points where he tries to apologize, I don't want to call it that, but downplay what he did, is he says, anybody who listened to my Nietzsche lectures in the late 1930s would see that there was clearly a confrontation with National Socialism in those Nietzsche lectures. I mean, I never criticized National Socialism per se, but they would know if they were sitting in on that because, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And you think, yeah, you're so brave, right? To be fucking reading these esoteric Nietzsche context and offer veiled criticisms of the regime that way. But the most telling notion is where he says, I'm still not convinced that democracy, and he uses that term in a very inclusive way, very encompassing way, excuse me, is the be all and end all. And then he implies that, look, these issues are settled in centuries, not in decades or even, over the course of a single century. And the implication really seems to be that history will vindicate me, right? It will realize that I made the wrong judgment call about Nazism as the solution to the problems of planetary nihilism. In fact, he says, now I realize that Nazism was just yet another indication of planetary nihilism. So I was right, but just I made the wrong judgment call in this instance, right? The bigger picture is still correct. And once people wake up to the bigger story that I'm trying to tell, they'll also realize that we need to get rid of liberalism, socialism, democracy, and progress towards something that, will look kind of like a fascistic politics or a nationalist politics. Who knows? He doesn't really get into specifics, right? So all that's to say, right? I think there's a lot to be learned from Heidegger. I really think that being in time has a lot of intellectual resources that anyone could profit from engaging with. Get a good guide to it, though, because it's a hard book. I also like some of the stuff that he writes about the history of philosophy. I have problems with it, but there's definitely a lot of interesting essays that he writes about Parmenides and Plato and Nietzsche. It's all worthwhile stuff to go through. But again, just be very aware, in my opinion, that if you are picking up his thinking, that it can lead you to some very dark places. And has led many people to some very dark places, right? There's a thriving alt-right Heidegger movement out there.
Yeah. And, and it is always fascinated that, to see the way that somebody like, the aforementioned Dr. Peterson, who, has really been embraced by the whole Anglosphere right wing. He's, working for the Daily Wire now. Mm-hmm. Will sort of do this thing where Karl Marx is permanently discredited by the crimes of Stalinism, but Heidegger, okay, literally a member of the Nazi Party, but somehow not discredited by that.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.